The United States and Iran stand at the most dangerous crossroads since the 2003 Iraq War. President Donald Trump has massed an unprecedented military armada in the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea. 2 aircraft carrier strike groups, more than a dozen warships, and over 150 fighter jets, including F-35s, F-22s, and F-16s, in preparation for potential military strikes against Iranian nuclear and missile infrastructure. The USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald R. Ford now sit within striking distance of Iran's coastline. Trump has given himself a 10-day window to decide whether diplomacy has reached its natural end. Talks in Geneva on February 17 yielded, in the words of Vice President J.D. Vance, only a little progress. Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has threatened that the United States may be struck so hard it cannot get back up. And Iran's ambassador to the United Nations has warned that all American bases in the region would be legitimate targets in the event of a strike. Iran's IRGC has shifted to an offensive defense doctrine, and mobile missile launchers have been repositioned across the country. A Quinnipiac poll shows 70% of Americans oppose military intervention, yet Trump's advisors estimate a 90% chance of kinetic action in coming weeks. Right now, as you watch this, 2 American aircraft carriers are sitting in the Persian Gulf, their flight decks armed and waiting. Over 150 warplanes have flooded the skies above the Middle East in just the last 72 hours. President Donald Trump has given himself 10 days to pull the trigger on what could be the biggest American military operation in more than 2 decades. And on the other side, Iran's supreme leader is threatening to hit American forces so hard, quote, they cannot get back up. This is not a drill. This is not a simulation. The world is hours, possibly days, away from a war that could reshape the entire planet. Stay with me. Every second of this story matters. Right now, as you watch this, 2 American aircraft carriers are sitting in the Persian Gulf, their flight decks armed and waiting. Over 150 warplanes have flooded the skies above the Middle East in just the last 72 hours. President Donald Trump has given himself 10 days to pull the trigger on what could be the biggest American military operation in more than 2 decades. And on the other side, Iran's supreme leader is threatening to hit American forces so hard they cannot get back up. This is not a drill. This is not a simulation. The world is hours, possibly days, away from a war that could reshape the entire planet. Stay with me. Every second of this story matters. Welcome back to the channel. What you are about to watch is the most important geopolitical briefing you will see all week. We are covering the 2026 United States-Iran crisis in full, end-to-end, with verified sources, confirmed military data, expert analysis, and a clear-eyed look at every scenario that could unfold over the next few days and weeks. Whether you follow Middle East politics, military strategy, energy markets, or you simply woke up this morning and saw U.S.-Iran war trending on every platform and wanted to understand what is actually happening, you have come to the right place. Let's go back to where this really began, because to understand where we are today, you have to understand the chain of events that brought the world to this moment. The 2026 Iran-United States crisis did not materialize out of thin air. It is the product of decades of mistrust, broken agreements, proxy wars, nuclear brinkmanship, and a sequence of events stretching back through 2025 and into the final weeks of 2024. In late 2025, Iran experienced the beginning of a major internal crisis. Economic collapse, rising inflation, unemployment, and a government increasingly unable to manage its own people produced a wave of nationwide protests that swept through Iranian cities. The regime's response was brutal. Mass arrests, live ammunition against demonstrators, and a systematic crackdown on civil society that drew international condemnation. Iran's economy, already strangled by years of U.S.-led sanctions, had been pushed past its breaking point by the fallout from the 2025 Iran-Israel 12-day war, in which Israel had targeted senior IRGC commanders, nuclear scientists, and military infrastructure inside Iran itself. And the United States had subsequently joined in striking Iranian nuclear facilities. Those U.S. strikes last summer on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan were not the end of the story. They were the beginning of a new and far more dangerous chapter. Iran's response at the time had been measured, almost restrained. Tehran fired missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, but gave U.S. forces advance warning, resulting in no American casualties. It was, analysts said, an attempt to strike back while managing escalation. But that restraint left a mark inside Tehran. The sense that Iran had shown weakness, that it had absorbed American and Israeli strikes and responded with a whisper rather than a roar. That calculus was about to change entirely. As protests intensified through late 2025 and into January 2026, the Iranian government faced a dual existential crisis: external military pressure from Washington and Jerusalem, and internal political disintegration from within. The crackdown intensified. Mass detentions, executions, cities under quasi-martial law. The images and videos coming out of Iran, smuggled past government censors and shared on X, Instagram, and Telegram, showed a country in full revolt. Iranian citizens in exile were flooding social media, begging Western governments not to negotiate with the regime, but rather to support what they were calling a nationwide struggle for freedom and democracy. On January 13th, 2026, Iranian officials crossed a rhetorical threshold that had enormous consequences. They publicly warned the United States that they were ready for war. The statement came as a direct response to President Trump's escalating rhetoric on Truth Social and in public remarks, in which he had threatened military action if Iran did not halt its crackdown and comply with international obligations. The U.S. government signaled that airstrikes remained on the table. All options, officials said, were under consideration. Diplomacy was preferred, but only barely. Within days, the U.S. military began repositioning assets on a scale not seen since the opening of the Iraq War in 2003. By January 25, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, CVN-72, had deployed into the Persian Gulf, accompanied by additional Navy and Air Force assets. This movement was officially described as a precautionary measure, a deterrent posture. But anyone who has followed U.S. military deployments in the region for the past 20 years understood what it actually meant. America was preparing. Qatar, one of Washington's most important partners in the region, sounded the alarm almost immediately. Qatari officials warned that any military escalation by the United States could have severe and unpredictable consequences for the entire Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Oman, Turkey, and Egypt joined in urging restraint, warning Washington that Iran retained short-range ballistic missiles and IRGC Navy assets capable of striking U.S. interests across the Gulf. None of these warnings changed the trajectory. Throughout the final week of January, President Trump used Truth Social to issue a series of escalating public warnings directed at Tehran, remarkable in their specificity and their tone. He declared that a massive American armada was heading toward Iran with great power, enthusiasm, and purpose, and that if Iran did not come to a deal, the next attack would be far worse. The world held its breath. February began with a series of dangerous incidents that showed just how close to the edge the situation had moved. On February 3rd, 6 Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy gunboats attempted to stop and seize a U.S.-flagged tanker, the Stena Imperative, in the Strait of Hormuz. The tanker ignored their demands and continued toward the Arabian Sea under the escort of the USS McFall, a guided missile destroyer. On the same day, a U.S. F-35 fighter jet shot down an Iranian Shahed 139 drone approaching the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln. These were not isolated incidents. They were the prelude to something much larger. On February 5th, Iran's IRGC Navy announced it had seized 2 foreign oil tankers near Farsi Island in the Persian Gulf, transferring them to the port of Bushehr. The IRGC claimed both vessels were involved in fuel smuggling operations. Western maritime analysts said the seizures were a demonstration of Iran's willingness and ability to disrupt global oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's petroleum liquids pass every single day. If that strait closes, even partially, energy markets around the world will convulse. On February 6th, indirect U.S.-Iran talks were held in Muscat, Oman, mediated by Omani Foreign Minister Badr bin Hamad al-Busaidi. Both sides described the nuclear-focused discussions as a good start. And privately, Secretary of State Marco Rubio told associates he was not sure you could reach a deal with, in his words, these guys. Vice President J.D. Vance expressed frustration that Supreme Leader Khamenei, who actually runs Iran, does not participate directly in negotiations, forcing all diplomatic contacts to go through Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, who cannot make binding commitments without Khamenei's approval. The structural problem of Iranian diplomacy was back in full view. The European Union, meanwhile, had labeled the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps a terrorist organization on January 29th, a significant designation that further isolated Tehran and made European participation in any nuclear deal framework more politically complicated. EU security analysts were warning publicly that the crisis risked what they called a dangerous nuclear proliferation cascade if diplomacy continued to collapse. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz, speaking at the Munich Security Conference, suggested that Iran's leadership could be in its final days and weeks. February 13 brought another jarring moment. Speaking at Fort Bragg, President Trump declared that regime change in Iran would be the best thing that could happen. It was a statement that crossed a line most administrations had carefully avoided. Explicitly calling for the overthrow of a foreign government is not diplomacy. It is a declaration of intent. And in Tehran, it was read as exactly that. The regime's security apparatus went into high alert. Satellite imagery captured in mid-February showed heightened activity at multiple IRGC bases. Mobile missile launchers being repositioned, aircraft being dispersed across the country, and increased IRGC Navy patrols in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz. On February 14, Trump announced he was dispatching a second carrier strike group, the USS Gerald R. Ford, to the Middle East. The Gerald Ford, CVN-78, is the most advanced aircraft carrier ever built. Its arrival in the region would mark the largest concentration of American naval firepower in the Middle East since 5 carrier battle groups assembled at the outset of Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. The message was unmistakable. The United States was not bluffing. By February 17, the second round of direct nuclear talks was held in Geneva. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and American envoys, including Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, and Jared Kushner, met for approximately 3 hours. The talks were described by the Americans as yielding only a little progress. The Iranians said good progress had been made. The gap between those characterizations tells you everything you need to know. During the talks, and in the hours that followed, Khamenei threatened United States warships in the area, saying Iran was capable of sinking them. The Strait of Hormuz was closed for several hours during a live Iranian military fire drill, a demonstration of Tehran's ability and willingness to disrupt global shipping at a moment of its choosing. On February 18th, the story moved into its most dangerous phase yet. Anonymous sources briefed Axios, CNN, and The Washington Post simultaneously. The combined picture was alarming. Trump's advisors told Axios there was a 90% chance of kinetic military action in the coming weeks. CNN reported that the U.S. military was prepared to strike Iran as early as February 21st. Senior national security officials gathered in the White House Situation Room to discuss Iran. Trump was briefed by Witkoff and Kushner on their Geneva talks. The White House issued a stark public warning. Tehran should make a deal. The window was closing. The same day, Trump posted on Truth Social that he was prepared to decide within 10 days whether to attack Iran following the deployment of the second carrier strike group. He also revealed, in a remarkable disclosure, that UK air bases at RAF Fairford and the shared facility at Diego Garcia in the British Indian Ocean Territory would be used by the United States in a strike on Iran should Iran fail to reach a nuclear agreement. This was not a hypothetical. This was operational planning made public. On February 19th, the New York Times reported that the USS Gerald Ford would initially deploy off the coast of Israel, while open-source flight tracking data confirmed that dozens of additional U.S. fighter jets had moved toward the Middle East in a single 24-hour period. Axios reported the total number of aircraft repositioned at more than 150 F-35s, F-22s, F-16s, and F-A-18s, the largest American Air Force presence in the Middle East since the 2003 Iraq War. At the same time, Iran's ambassador to the United Nations sent a formal letter to the Security Council warning that if Iran were attacked, all nearby bases, facilities, and assets of the hostile force would constitute legitimate targets. Iran had approximately 40,000 American troops within range, spread across 13 regional bases in Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, and elsewhere. Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, speaking in his most belligerent tone in years, warned that any conflict would become a regional war and that Iran's response would be swift, decisive, and unconstrained by America's calculations. Iran's Defense Council went a step further, declaring that the Islamic Republic did not consider itself limited to responding only after an attack, that what it called objective signs of threat were now part of Iran's security calculus. In plain language, Iran was reserving the right to strike first. Now let us understand something crucial about the strategic environment that most news coverage is missing. Iran today is not the Iran of 2018 or even 2022. The 12-day war of June 2025 with Israel and the subsequent U.S. strikes on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan fundamentally altered Iran's threat perception. Iranian commanders and analysts now believe, based on internal documents and statements that have leaked to Western intelligence agencies, that the United States is not preparing for a symbolic strike or a one-night operation. They believe Washington is planning a short but high-impact military campaign designed to permanently cripple Iran's missile infrastructure, dismantle what remains of its nuclear program, and reset the regional balance of power in a way that prevents Iran from ever again threatening Israel or U.S. forces from a position of military strength. Iran's response to this assessment has been to shift its entire defense doctrine. The IRGC's Abdolrahim Mousavi announced publicly that Iran has revised its defense doctrine and shifted to an offensive doctrine in which Iran's action will be swift, decisive, and unconstrained by America's calculations. This is not bluster. This is a doctrinal shift with real operational implications. Iran is telling Washington that it will not absorb a U.S. strike and modestly retaliate as it did in 2025. This time, Iran intends to maximize the cost to the United States from the very first hour of any conflict. What does that actually look like in practice? Iran has, according to a March 2025 Defense Intelligence Agency report cited by Stars and Stripes, the largest stockpile of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drone systems in the Middle East. The country's arsenal of underwater drones, submarines, torpedoes, and fast attack speedboats was specifically designed to attack U.S. warships operating in and around Iranian territorial waters. And now, there are two carrier strike groups, each representing an enormous concentration of military value, sitting within Iranian missile range. Iran's Houthi partners in Yemen retain some capacity to add to any Iranian response, as do Iranian-aligned militias in Iraq. The economic stakes are equally severe. The Strait of Hormuz, through which Iran has already demonstrated it can disrupt shipping, is the transit corridor for roughly 17 to 21 million barrels of oil per day. A war in the Persian Gulf, even a short one, would almost certainly produce an oil price shock of historic proportions. Global energy markets are already pricing in a risk premium. A Brent crude spike to $130 or even $150 per barrel is not beyond the range of possibility if strikes begin and Iran retaliates against Gulf Arab oil infrastructure, a threat Tehran has made explicitly. Now let us turn to the diplomatic picture as of this morning, February 25, 2026. Oman confirmed on February 23rd that a new round of U.S.-Iran nuclear talks would be held in Geneva this week. Both Iran and the United States signaled before those talks that they were prepared for war if the negotiations failed. The core issue remains Iran's nuclear enrichment program. By late 2024, the IAEA had reported that Iran was enriching uranium to levels approaching weapons grade, well beyond any credible civilian nuclear purpose, and had accumulated a stockpile of highly enriched uranium unprecedented in Iranian nuclear history. The United States insists on a complete halt to enrichment. Iran insists that enrichment is a national right under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Republican Senators Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton have publicly stated that any nuclear agreement with Iran would require Senate approval, and that Senate Republicans would only approve an agreement that included full dismantlement of Iran's enrichment infrastructure, an end to Iran's ballistic missile program, and a halt to Iranian support for regional proxy groups. That is not a negotiating position. That is a list of demands that would require Iran to fundamentally reconstitute its entire regional and domestic security architecture. No Iranian government, not even a reformist one, could accept those terms and survive politically. Within Iran itself, reports from Reuters citing 4 current Iranian officials speaking on condition of anonymity reveal that high-level officials have warned Supreme Leader Khamenei that a U.S. strike could trigger a fresh wave of internal protest that the regime might not be able to suppress. The Critical Threats Project has reported that fear is no longer a deterrent among Iran's population. The government's brutal crackdown has not extinguished the protest movement. It has radicalized it. Khamenei faces a strategic nightmare. If he concedes to Washington's demands, he looks weak and may face internal political challenges. If he refuses and the U.S. strikes, the resulting crisis might end the regime entirely. Let's talk about the American military options, because CNN's Brett McGurk published a detailed analysis on February 23rd that outlines what a U.S. operation against Iran might actually look like. Unlike earlier U.S. military operations that were time-bound and tethered to defined objectives, a new campaign against Iran would begin without a clearly defined end state. Military planners would face 3 distinct target sets simultaneously. First, Iran's air defense and missile systems. Second, Iran's ballistic missile production facilities, launchers, and stockpiles, including mobile missile units dispersed across the country. And third, Iran's nuclear program, including the known sites at Fordow and Natanz, and critically, the new facility being constructed under what analysts call Pickaxe Mountain, located about a mile south of Natanz. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, and other senior Pentagon leaders have raised concerns about the scale, complexity, and potential for U.S. casualties in a major extended military operation against Iran. They have also warned about the strain such an operation would place on U.S. weapons stockpiles, particularly munitions needed to support Israel and Ukraine. The scenario that worries most defense experts is not the initial strike. The scenario that worries them is what comes next. Iran has already signaled, and this is now doctrine, not rhetoric, that it will escalate rather than absorb. That means U.S. bases in Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain could face ballistic missile salvos. U.S. naval assets in the Gulf could face swarm attacks from IRGC speedboats, submarines, and anti-ship cruise missiles. For Trump, the political calculus is complicated. A Quinnipiac University poll conducted in mid-January found that 70% of Americans, including a majority of Republicans, oppose military intervention in Iran. The initial strikes might generate a rally around the flag effect, but if American troops begin dying in significant numbers, the political dynamic will shift with terrifying speed. So where does all of this leave us? As of the morning of February 25, 2026, The probability of a significant U.S. military strike on Iran in the next 10 to 30 days is, by the assessment of multiple senior U.S. officials, intelligence analysts, and former military commanders, higher than at any point in the past decade. The diplomatic path is not closed. There is a third round of talks scheduled, but the conditions for a deal are not present. Trump has publicly framed this as a narrowing window. His advisors are telling journalists on background that the boss is getting fed up. One Trump advisor put the odds of military action at 90%. Former IDF military intelligence chief Amos Yadlin put it bluntly at the Munich Security Conference. He said he was uncertain whether he would feel comfortable traveling abroad this coming weekend. A comment that only carries the weight it does when you understand that Yadlin is a man who has spent his career assessing existential threats to his country. When he says the situation is closer than it has ever been, you listen. The question now is whether the third round of Geneva talks produces a diplomatic breakthrough that no one at this point appears to believe is likely. Or whether Donald Trump makes the call that sends America into its most consequential military engagement since the invasion of Iraq. The Middle East is waiting. The world is watching. The carriers are in position. The planes are fueled. The decision is one man's to make. We will continue to monitor this story in real time, and we will bring you every verified update the moment it becomes available. If you want to stay ahead of this story, hit the subscribe button right now. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand what is happening in the Middle East right now. Leave a comment below telling us what you think Trump will decide. This is the most dangerous moment in U.S.-Iran relations in a generation. The stakes are not just regional, they are global. An oil shock of historic proportions, a potential nuclear proliferation cascade, the destabilization of the entire Gulf region, and the possibility of American casualties on a scale not seen since Iraq. All of it hangs in the balance of a decision that may come within the next 10 days. Stay informed, stay calm, stay with us.